Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 p.m. in New York, and let's give it a couple of minutes for everyone to join before we start the session. Welcome, everyone, to the Banyan Impact Fellowship for Service in India information session. We're delighted that you could join us today. My name is Hari, and I'm the program manager for the Banyan Impact Fellowship, and I'm based out of New York. And I see that a lot of you are joining from different parts of the world. So thank you so much for making time to join us today. I also have with me our 2024 Banyan Impact Fellowship alumni, Sydney, with us. Welcome, Sydney. In a short while, we will hear a lot more about Sydney Jarvis's fellowship experience. But to begin with, let's get started with the fellowship. So the goal of the session is to provide you with more information about the fellowship itself, its structure, and how you can apply for the fellowship. Now, now a little bit about the structure of the session. I will start with the presentation for about 10 minutes, talking to you about the program. Then our fellowship alumni, Sydney, will join us to share her fellowship experience, followed by the question and answer session. So I encourage everyone to post their questions in the comment section, and we will get to the questions at the end of the session. Banyan Impact Fellowship is American India Foundation's oldest program. It started in 2001. It was earlier known as the William J. Clinton Fellowship for Service in India. American India Foundation is committed to improving the lives of the underprivileged, especially women, children, and youth. The Banyan Impact Fellowship is a binational volunteer service program in the India US corridor, with the mission to building a lasting bridge between the US and India. The fellows, part of the first cohort, worked on disaster relief, but over the past 20 plus years, we have evolved the program and it has reached 573 fellows working across 255 partner organizations and in various projects that are related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The Banyan Impact Fellowship is a 10-month volunteer service program in India between September and June. The program brings together both Americans and Indians to foster a meaningful connection. And this happens through matching with a grassroots NGO in the development sector in India to accelerate impact. Fellows, along with the host organization, define a project scope for the fellowship to serve the community on ground. The thematic areas of the project that fellows work on, like I said, have expanded from disaster relief to various areas such as education, public health, livelihoods, climate justice and environment protection, minority rights, and many more. Here is a list of some of the benefits that the program offers. One, the program provides living stipend to all the fellows applying to the program. The visa and the travel expenses for the program are covered as part of the program. You also get a health insurance and a mental health counseling support system as part of the fellowship. There's also language training that is available as part of the fellowship. Besides that, fellows get periodic mentoring programs through our senior fellows who are seasoned social sector professionals. And there is an ongoing track of mentorship that happens between senior fellows and the incoming cohort of fellows during your Banyan Impact Fellowship. There are also other avenues for professional development. You can utilize grants to visit, conferences within India and also do site visits. There'll be multiple networking opportunities and career opportunities for you to interact with the 500 plus alumni that we have as part of the Banyan Impact Fellowship and other social impact organizations within India. Besides that, we also have the Virtual Leadership Institute in partnership with Atlas Corps, where you get to meet other emerging leaders from the globe, and to sort of work with them on emerging leadership issues. We also have a graduate alumni community portal where you can interact with alumni for mentorship support and connections within the sector. Here is a testimonial from a fellow, Erin. Erin was serving in Rajasthan in Jaipur with an organization called EcoRap. She worked with the rural community from the Rajasthan region and was working with recycling waste materials to build products. Her project was to empower women in the rural villages by working alongside to secure sustainable means of livelihood through micro enterprise opportunities. We also have Maitreyi, who's a 2017-18 Banyan Impact Fellow. Maitreyi worked in education in making learning more accessible and fun. She served in Gujarat and India. I'll talk a little bit about the selection criteria right now. Our application for the 2025-26 cohort is open, and the eligibility criteria are as follows. You need to be a US citizen or permanent resident or an Indian citizen to be eligible for the Banyan Impact Fellowship. You also need to be between 21 and 35 years of age. Um, and you need to have a bachelor's degree by the time the fellowship starts in September. You should also be eager to learn with host communities and have a commitment to positive and sustainable change in the US India bridge building. Here is a quick snapshot of the fellowship selection process and structure. So the first step is the application process. So here are two things that we look for. One is your essays. We look for your motivation, why you, why now, and why the fellowship for your motivation. And in terms of the second part, there is an interview that happens with an alumni or a staff. Once that's complete, you move to the matching stage. So matching stage is between host organization and shortlisted fellows, where the fellows and the host organization get an opportunity to interact. You can match up to three organizations for interactions. Once you're selected as a fellow, that is when you have a successful match with a host organization, you are part of the Banyan Impact Fellowship. And then, your training starts. So the training is broadly classified as beginning of the fellowship, middle of the fellowship, and end of the fellowship training, besides the ongoing training and support that you get in the form of mentorships, periodic professional development sessions that you have throughout the year. Like I mentioned earlier, the fellowship starts in September with the beginning of the year orientation, which is a 3-day in-person orientation that happens in India. Post which, you go to your host organizations where you start your fellowship, and there is ongoing training and mentorship that happens throughout. And then we all convene again for a thematic conference in February where we do a midpoint review of the fellowship, and the fellowship concludes with a public seminar in June. Now that we've had an opportunity to sort of go through key aspects of the fellowship, the benefits, the timeline, I'm going to invite Sydney back into the conversation, and requesting her to share an overview of the placement city, host organization, and the project that she worked on during her fellowship. Over to you, Sydney.
Yeah, thank you, Hari. It's nice to see people from different places tuning in, so thanks for being here. And I'm here to kind of answer any questions and talk about my own experience because I just finished the fellowship earlier this year in August. So my name's Sydney, I like she, her pronouns, and I was placed in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, with my host organization was Center for Environment Education. So it's actually an NGO with branches all over India, doing really interesting work. But my main project was developing a teacher training module on climate change education for middle school teachers. That was actually not the only thing that I got to work on, but that was my main project that I spent a lot of my time working on. And other projects had to do with curriculum analysis. We actually got to work with UNESCO on one of the projects, and then different training programs all over. So that was a little bit about kind of my background. Oh, here you're muted. You're muted. Sorry.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you so much for sharing that. Requesting everyone who are part of the live to add any questions that you have to the comment section. We will start the discussion with frequently asked questions with Sydney, and then follow it up with the questions that you're posting on the comment section. So Sydney, thank you so much for introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your fellowship overview. Could you tell us a time, if you were to go back a year and think about a key highlight from your fellowship, what would that be?
Yeah, I think something that I still think about today and something that I'm still really proud of from my time in the fellowship was working on the UNESCO project that I just mentioned. So the project was to take these educational guidelines, how to make schools greener in India that UNESCO had developed. They developed it as kind of like guidelines for schools worldwide on how to green education. And they wanted to make sure that those would be applicable to Indian schools and then all over the world as well. So India was one of the champion countries of the Greening Education Partnership, which is still an ongoing global project that UNESCO is doing. And our job at CEE was to take this UNESCO guideline and pilot it in India. So I got to visit schools. One of the pictures up here is visiting one of the schools that we were working with, to talk with teachers, talk with students about how they would apply these guidelines, and then also look at the national curriculum and some of the education policies that are more recently released in India to see how those kind of would integrate with this global curriculum. So we actually wrote a blog post about this. So if you're interested, you can find it on the AIF website. But it was like a tight deadline. I actually finished part of the report on a train when I was headed for a weekend trip, but it was something that I was really proud of. I got to meet a lot of different people and really take ownership of that project. And then actually now, back in, I guess, April, the UNESCO guidelines were globally launched, and they acknowledged CEE and every one of us on the team by name in those documents. So that was really, really cool, and something that, you know, I get to say that I contributed to that has this really big global impact that I'm still like really personally proud of, like all the hard work that we put into that report, and it was well received.
That is great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sydney. I think I'm going to make you, time travel a little bit to sort of your, interview process. I'm sure, that must have been nerve wracking. And most of the people who are joining the live today would be more curious to sort of understand how did the matching process happen? And if you can walk through your experience of, your interview process.
Sure. Well, so I came into the process knowing broadly that I knew I wanted to work internationally. And then within that, knew that I had an interest in education. And then AIF kind of came on my radar, and I started doing more research. And then once I got past that first application process, you submit your written application, then you do an interview. And then, as Hari was explaining, you have uh, a matching process. So going into that, I knew I wanted to work kind of in the middle of the Venn diagram of climate and education. So with that mindset, it kind of narrowed down some of the host organizations, and there's a huge variety of projects to choose from. So if you're not interested in climate or education, don't be deterred. There's public health and so many different sectors that the host organizations are working within. But I knew that was my goal. I wanted to work with an organization that was doing climate work and education, or something kind of with both of those themes. And I had shortlisted for myself 3 organizations that worked in those sectors in different ways, 3 very different organizations in 3 different parts of India. And I interviewed with all 3 of them and made sure that I was asking not only about the work that they were doing and kind of the like, what will the full 10 months look like, but also like, what does daily life look like in the office? What are the work hours? What are the expectations? And kind of trying to understand through the matching process, like what the next 10 months of my life would look like while on the fellowship. So I found that really, really good match with CEE. I spoke with the supervisor that then I worked very closely with for the 10 months. And she really gave me a good idea of the not only just the main project I would be working on, but the other things that I could get involved in while at the host organization. So definitely, as you're like thinking farther ahead, make sure that you have kind of an idea of what you want to get out of the fellowship, whether that be, in whatever sector that is of interest of yours, or the type of work. Is it like grant writing? Is it like really working with students specifically? Is it like you want to be in a hospital working on public health? So think about like the things that you specifically want to get out of it by the end of the 10 months.
That's great advice, Sydney. Thank you so much for sharing that, especially for people who sort of keen on applying for the fellowship. I see questions coming in the comment section. We will wrap up with 2 more frequently asked questions and then take those questions up. Sydney, now that you've shared, a key highlight from your fellowship and also had an opportunity to share, how you sort of interacted with the host organization, came up with a scope and your project details. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the key challenges you faced during your fellowship and how you navigated them? Yeah.
Yeah. So The cohort itself is a mix of both Indian people and US citizens. So it's a really good source of support. And so working through some of the challenges, I found that the cohort was a really good place to kind of ask questions. But I think specifically speaking of challenges, for me as an American coming into the program, I think that my challenges really differ from like an Indian person that is going to join the cohort and join the fellowship. So speaking of that, I think the biggest challenge for me was figuring out housing in India, especially learning just with the support of my host organization, with the kind of intel from different people in the cohort who gave me great advice. I think that was one of the biggest upfront challenges, because you have to figure it out on your own, which I think is like a good challenge, but it also means that you get full ownership of it, right? You're not like placed into housing that you don't have any control over. So what I ended up doing was, I was in Ahmedabad, which is a huge major city. I got to use Facebook, and then connected with some different people through there, and went and looked at housing with some of my colleagues. So I got support from the host organization as well. But I think that was just like a major challenge, like adjusting to kind of how it works and who to talk to and what things cost and everything. And it's at the beginning of the fellowship. So you're also getting, I was also getting used to working in a new office and meeting all these new people and adjusting to a new major city. So I think that was a big challenge for me. But yeah, another challenge that I think, regardless of if you're a US citizen or an Indian citizen starting this fellowship, is also just understanding that every host organization will have a different work culture and different kind of communication and organizational styles. So this is true whether or not you're working in a different country, but staying open-minded about how to communicate with people in the office, knowing that coming in as a fellow, they may or may not understand exactly what a fellow is. And you're kind of in this in-between space of a full-time position that really gets to sink your teeth into the good work that's happening, but also understanding that you're only there for 10 months, which is, at the end of the day, like it flies by quite quickly. So it's an adjustment to understand how the work culture is at your organization. That just comes down to staying open-minded and asking questions and trying to set up really positive communication with like your coworkers and your supervisor and things like that. So those are kind of challenges that I think everyone will face, and I think it's like a really good forgiving kind of set up to like learn those lessons, and like they understand that you're there for like good exposure, you're there to contribute. I mean, I felt very welcomed to the conversations that were happening around bigger decisions that would affect the projects that we were working on. So that just kind of comes as an adjustment as well, getting used to the like work culture of different organizations.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think a key part of the fellowship is exactly what you described, is to sort of go in with this service leadership mindset into the host organization, trying to see how you can be of service. So thank you so much for sharing that. Tell us a little bit about how was it, coping with a different language and culture. And I know you spoke a little bit about this earlier too. So if you want to expand a little bit on that, and how did you sort of go about finding your community? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, in terms of like language and cultural differences, I would say the fellowship really provides a good amount of support for like language training. So actually, the picture in the bottom left corner is myself with Miss Lovely Ma'am, who was my Hindi teacher, and this is also for the language aspect, an important thing to ask in your matching process of like, what is kind of the language that's used in your organization most commonly, and make sure you're kind of keeping that in mind. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to speak that language, but just know the answers to those questions and do some research on the areas that you're interested in going, because so many different languages are spoken around India. So For language, AIF provides a choice for you. They have some connections with different schools and different institutions around India that do like online or in-person language training, and they can set it up for you, or you can take your own path and find a teacher for yourself. So I actually connected with Lovely Ma'am just through finding her website. She ended up being like a 15-minute walk from my office, and she does tuition lessons, like private lessons for children actually. But I asked her if she could kind of incorporate that and like teach me Hindi. So I got kind of the basics from that, definitely beginner level Hindi, and was able to communicate with like the housemates that I had. They also spoke English, or like people on the street, or getting directions or giving directions to an autowala or something like that. But in terms of like cultural differences and adjusting to that, my biggest piece of advice is to go second. And what I mean by that is, if you're in a new situation, especially for the Americans that will be on this fellowship, if you're in a new situation where you're not really sure kind of what is going to happen, you haven't been given expectations, you're like figuring it out on the spot, go second. Don't put yourself in the front of the line to figure out, okay, how is this process going to work? So I'll give you an example. When I had first arrived in Ahmedabad, it was the Navratri festival that was happening. And so we were invited to a lot of garbas to go dancing. It's a 9-day dancing festival in Gujarat for all over India, for those of you who don't know. And I knew I had done some research on Hinduism, and I kind of knew a little bit about the festival itself, but I'd never done an arti myself. So I was invited to do that, but I said, okay, let me just observe for a second and then I'll happily join. But I'm very glad, because I got to kind of observe about how people were doing that, making sure I was being respectful. And then people were very happy that me and the other Americans that were there got to participate in that. So go second, observe, take a step back and make sure you're verifying how much space you're taking up, and kind of seeing how other people are approaching the situation. That's how I would kind of say I adjusted with like cultural differences. And then just to take that a step further, of like not only like adjusting and observing, but also kind of finding my own community. I would say definitely think about the hobbies that you like and what you like to do now in your free time, wherever that is, and then connect with people that do the same thing in your new area. So I connected with some different people in the art community in Ahmedabad. So I'm really into film photography, and found other people. There's one film processing lab in Ahmedabad, and I reached out to them, and they actually do photo walks. So a group of people gets together and they'll explore a new part of the city, or go to a cafe together and talk about photos. And then, of course, we ended up talking about other things. So I would say, whatever you're doing now, and especially if there are like new things that might crop up in different areas, definitely keep that in mind, and don't be afraid to like reach out to organizations, different like communities and things like that, because that started as film photography and then turned into a friend group. So that's kind of how I found some community in Ahmedabad.
That's wonderful. Great to hear. And especially, what you spoke about, Garba painted a very vivid imagery for me. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I think let's quickly, browse through the questions that people are putting in the comment section and probably answer them. If you have not gotten an opportunity to add your question, please go ahead and add your questions to the comment section. We'd be going through them in a chronological order. So Ankit here has asked, I'm turning 36 on 1st October exactly, and I had read on the official website that you need to be up to 35 years old on 1st October. You're right, Ankit. So there is an age cap for the fellowship. It's between 21 and 35. In terms of the next question, Kennedy says, hello from Atlanta. Hey, Kennedy. Could you talk about how your duties at your host organization aligned with the interest you expressed in your application? So, Sydney, probably you can talk about how your interests and your long-term goals sort of, matched with the host organization duties that you performed during your fellowship.
Yeah, sure. Kenny, that's a really good question. And especially if you have specific interests, like keep that in mind of like when you kind of go through the matching process, bring that up. But I would say, so with the fellowship, you are placed with a host organization that has usually one specific project that they want you to work on, but that won't be the only thing that you'll be working on. So for some host organizations, they'll probably expand on what you're doing based on what they need done, which is what you're there to do, right? It is like service learning. It is trying to kind of serve the community that you're joining, and like step up where you're needed. But I would also say, like, keeping in mind like what you want to get out of it, you can talk to different people at your host organization and see if you have kind of like options that might be available to you. If you're more interested in like working in the community and doing field visits, and maybe even going out into rural areas, talking to more people and seeing where you can like join those opportunities. Often, I mean, one of the pictures showed me, we did some rural field visits with other projects that were happening at Center for Environment Education that weren't projects that I was working on, but they were like, yeah, you can come along. And that was because I had talked to people before, and made myself kind of like a friendly person around the office campus that we were working on. So yeah, I would say keep those interests in mind as you're like thinking about the projects that are not only the ones that are assigned to you, but also ones that you might be able to kind of insert yourself in and get some good exposure as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sydney. I think the next question is from Kunzang. What do mentorship relationships look like in the program? What are specific mentorship activities? Is every fellow paired with a mentor? Probably I can give an overarching answer to this and then pass it on to Sydney. So the mentorship is structured in a way that based on the thematic area that you're working on today, with the host organization, you're mapped to a senior fellow who's an expert in the space in India. So each fellow is mapped to a mentor, and you sort of have like a monthly check-in with them to sort of work with them on your project. So that's a little bit, about the mentorship that I wanted to share before I passed on to Sydney.
Yeah, so we have a mentor within AIF, as Hari said, but then we also have a senior fellow who is not an employee of AIF, but a leader in the development field. So my senior fellow actually was deputy director of two different organizations and was involved in lots of different kinds of activities. So I met with him on a like as needed basis. So it was really nice because I wasn't overwhelmed, because you're getting mentorship from your supervisor at your host organization. You have an AIF staff mentor that's kind of checking in with like the adjustment of moving to India and like any issues that are coming up that they might be able to like help solve or mitigate or give suggestions for. And then you also have this senior fellow that's like a mentor within the field. So as kind of I would talk about like in the 10 months, we met, and at the beginning I had like lots of questions. How can I approach this issue that I'm facing with the project? Like, we're really maybe not being efficient with the time that we have with the run up to the deadline, and we kind of talked through some of the issues of things that were stressing me out. And then once I kind of figured it out, we didn't see each other as much, but then towards the end of the fellowship, I had more questions about like bigger topic, like bigger picture questions about the development sphere. And then actually I interviewed my senior fellow as one of the blog posts that I did. So again, a plug for the AIF blogs, but he was a really wonderful person to at least just have somebody to rely on if there were like bigger issues coming up, or like, has this ever happened to you? And he would kind of validate, yeah, this happens all the time, or like, okay, maybe something is off with that. But in terms of mentorship, you definitely are covered with this fellowship.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Raj Mehta asks, he's curious to hear your perspective on a few points. What was your biggest takeaway from the fellowship? And what was the primary manner in which you grew, like personally, professionally, spiritually, etc.? I think I'll sort of scaffold the questions. Probably you can take these two first. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, those are really good questions, Raj. My and kind of hard to answer because 10 months, it's like, think about the last 10 months of your life. What was the biggest thing, right? So it's just, I mean, the whole experience, I think, is a huge opportunity for growth. For me personally, I think my biggest takeaway was understanding India better. And that was my goal going into it. I mean, as someone who's interested in development sphere and education, India has the biggest education system in the world. And as somebody who's like still learning about these fields, I wanted to make sure that I understood this side of the world that's often, I mean, at least in US context, not included or overlooked. So for me personally, it was understanding India on a much deeper level. And the kind of the way that I grew the most, as you're kind of talking about the primary manner in which I grew personally, professionally, spiritually. I think personally, I mean, it's an immersive experience. You're in a completely different place. That you have, like, you're forced to grow into it. It is challenging. I think like it's kind of a different path that people might choose to take. It's not just staying in your hometown. It is going to be challenging. But I think personally, like from figuring out housing, from taking ownership of projects that I felt like I could step up and like be included, and like finding my voice, finding out how to like advocate for my ideas, I think, yeah, was like a huge way that that I changed through the fellowship and got to make some really cool connections within those 10 months. So I would say personally.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think the third question, Sydney, you earlier covered about, how the fellowship experience sort of shapes your long-term aspirations and goals. If there's anything else to add, please do. Or we could move to the next question too.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit about that. Uh, I so my supervisor actually and my host organization goes to COP, the climate global climate conference every year, and I like be through the host organization now kind of understand like a much bigger global picture of like climate finance, climate conversations that happen, like the geopolitics about that. So I would say that was a really interesting way that kind of I had a before the fellowship had a clear kind of professional path that I was thinking about, but that expanded it. And the like kinds of personal connections that you can make through this are really impactful. So that's what I would kind of add to that.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think we're coming to the last two questions. So if people do have any questions, add them to the comments so we can, include them in the question and answer session. For now, the next question is, is there a standard list of organizations that AIF is involved with, or does it vary from year to year? Like my colleague Megan has already answered on the chat, regarding host organizations, AIF has a network of existing partners who've hosted BIF fellows in the past, but we also sort of, add new partners each year. So that's the answer. Natalie says, thank you so much for the session. I was wondering how big your cohort was and how many fellows were in each placement city. And how are you incorporating your experiences from India now post fellowship?
Yeah, I can
Yes.
speak on that one, or if you'd like to.
Yeah, so Natalie, roughly each cohort is between 25 to 30 fellows. So we sort of ensure the fellows are sort of scattered across different regions within India. It happens so that sometimes fellows get placed in the same placement city, which means then you also have another Banyan Impact fellow in your city, or sometimes even in the host organization. But there is no sort of pattern year on year that we follow to saying, we place X number of fellows in a city or a host organization for that matter. It differs cycle to cycle. In terms of how Sydney sort of incorporated her experiences from India now post fellowship, probably I'll leave that to Sydney. She's already spoken a lot about her fellowship experience and how that shaped up. She can probably add to that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I finished the fellowship in end of July, early August. And since then I've actually been traveling. So that was like a huge way that my experience working in India kind of influenced me. I wanted to take a little bit of time in between and like travel, which is also something that I got to do while I was on the fellowship. Um, but in terms of like professional experiences, as I have mentioned, we worked on like curriculum analysis. So I was doing like report writing, which I think is a really transferable skill. I was also doing, as I mentioned, the main project was developing an educational module for adult learners for middle school teachers. So actually, right now I'm in the process of applying for jobs, and I have found that as I'm interviewing, I've gotten a few different interviews. As I'm interviewing, I'm able to adapt the experiences that I had in India to the skills that I'm kind of looking at, like on job descriptions now that are like report and grant writing, like working with adult learners or like working with like a CRM or some kind of like online software that I maybe not necessarily have worked with specifically, but had other exposure to, and just the breadth of exposure that I had has like really been able to kind of fuel the job interview conversations and questions that I've been getting. So I think that's definitely one of the ways that's kind of incorporating those experiences into my professional life.
Okay, thank you for that. I think Bakshish asks, how does the fellows benefit being an alumni to the fellowship? So, Bakshish, probably I'll start the answer and then maybe pass it on to Sydney for her to share her experience. In terms of, alumni, we have close to 573 alumni now from close to 24 cohorts that have graduated in the last 24 years. So, our alumni, close to 60% of them are working in the social impact space, are major leaders in the social impact space. Some of them are also, faculty teaching in policy schools. So the network is so vast. So the sort of connections that alumni sort of make for the fellows within the sector and the space is huge. And alumni sort of also have mixers through which they sort of interact with each other, leverage the network within the alumni space. And in terms of engagement, we have a portal called the Graduate Portal, where alumni could sign up for opportunities to mentor other incoming fellows, connect with other alumni in the region over coffee chats. So the portal is a place where alumni sort of engage with other alumni too. Sydney, any thoughts as a freshly graduated alumni on how you're finding this new role to be?
Yeah, I would say the online portal is really helpful, and also the orientation, midpoint, and endpoint are like chock full of opportunities to not only ask questions but also just hear from alumni of like what they're doing now. So at each of those in-person conferences throughout the fellowship, we have alumni that come back and like talk about they'll we have like panels and things like that. So that was really helpful. But actually, I was going to mention earlier in the slides, Hari had a testimonial from Erin, who I'm actually in touch with because we kind of working in like climate spaces, and so we've been having like chat conversations about like how my job search is going and things like that. So it's also kind of down to a personal level. The alumni network is just a lot of really smart people that are working in similar fields and have faced similar challenges, and then you're like brought together through AIF. So it's a really good network, I would say.
Yeah, great. In terms of what is AIF looking for in an application, my colleague Megan has also answered that question, Francis. But like I mentioned earlier, with the application process, the first stage is the application process. It has two rounds: one where you fill an online application, and two is an interview. With the online application, you have three short essays, 200 to 300 words, and one video prompt for something that you will see once you start filling in your application, which is again a 60-second video prompt. Now, what we look for is, like I mentioned earlier, your motivation for the fellowship. What skills do you bring in to the fellowship? So, why you, why now, and why the fellowship, right? So, those are some of the aspects that we look for in your application. But like my colleague Megan has mentioned, more on the website for you. Um, Kennedy asks, would you say that your cohort and AI have provided support for your transition to your host city and culture? Just curious if you mostly had to take initiative to learn your new surroundings.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. I mean, so as we've talked about, the cohort is all over India, and then like a couple of the fellows, several different fellows, might end up with like 2 or 3 fellows in the same location. So that really just depends on the matching process because that's such a personal thing, and the organizations are all over India. But we are like all in the same WhatsApp group. We're all going through that. Okay, how was everybody's first week at their new placements? How are we feeling? Like anybody know anybody in Rajasthan with connections with like this organization or like helping finding housing? So I would say the cohort definitely is a great place of support for that. And AIF has a lot of institutional support, so like set up supports. The host organization helps you find housing and things like that. But I will say, like, it's all up to you, right? Like who you connect with and where you want to live and everything. It's part of the fellowship to like take ownership and take initiative over these things with support. So it is up to you about like what interests of yours you want to get involved in, or like figuring out your own transportation and like how to cook and clean for yourself and things like that. So it's a balance. I think it's definitely part of the fellowship is part of that is like taking initiative to both involve yourself in the community and also at your host organization in a professional sense, but with like a lot of support behind you, both informal from the other people in the cohort that are going through the same things, and then also formally through like the systems of support that AIF has set up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sydney, for sharing that. I think I skipped a question that Ankit had asked. He had followed up on the age needs to be maximum 35 in September or October. Like Megan had replied, Ankit, it's October 1st. So, yeah. I hope that answers your question. Nisha Kishore asks, is there any way we can see the list of partners for this upcoming cycle? Nisha, we share the partner organizations and the initial scope with shortlisted candidates. So if you're shortlisted for the fellowship, you'll be able to see that. But if you go to the website, you'll be able to see partners in the past that we've worked with. In the next slide, I'm also happy to share my email ID in case you're not able to locate it. I'm happy to share that with you. Awesome. I think that brings us to the end of the question and answer session. Sydney, once again, thank you so much for making time and agreeing to do this, and really being a wonderful, fellow and alumni now to sort of share your experiences with other prospective applicants. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you everyone for joining us. I know some of you all are joining us from India, where it's midnight now. So really appreciate you taking the time out to joining us for this virtual info session. We definitely look forward to receiving your applications. Our applications are live now. You can go to our website and start applying for the fellowship. If you have any questions, please stay in touch and write to either Sydney at sydneyjarvis@gmail.com or me at Hari Sivasubramanya Pandian at aif.org. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And thank you, Hadi, for including me in this. It was great to share my experience.
Yes, thank you so much.